everybody, we're back and we're covering Chapter 21, Cognitive Development in Adulthood, ages 25 to 65. Okay, let's start off in this section talking about intelligence. We talked a little bit about intelligence during childhood, and so now we have reached adulthood and we should be at our optimal intellectual functioning. Most of the research on intelligence and theories about intelligence have really focused on adults, so it makes a lot of sense to talk about general intelligence in this age group. So general intelligence was labeled G by Spearman, and he thought that general intelligence was a trait. He thought it was a basic problem-solving capability, that you either have it or you don't, and that the people who have more of it are able to solve a wide variety of problems with minimal effort and with a lot of accuracy compared to people who have less of this trait. We're going to infer the existence of general intelligence through performance on specific kinds of tests. There are mechanical tests that can be used to assess G, because since it's a basic problem-solving capability, we should be able to measure it in lots of different ways. So there are mechanical ability tests that would measure G. There are spatial ability tests that can measure G. There are verbal tests, which are probably the ones that you think of when you think of an intelligence test. And then there are mathematical, which might also be what you think of when you think of an intelligence test. So some of these probably look different than what you would expect to be part of an intelligence test, and some of them probably look very much like what you would expect. Vocabulary, memory, reasoning pertaining to these topics are going to be part of each of the subtests. If we're testing your mechanical skill, part of it would be you knowing the names of the things that you're using. If you're doing a spatial test, we're going to be looking for not only your knowledge of the names of things, but also, can you remember the position in space or things like that. So, like I said, if it's a trait, the assumption is that people possess varying amounts of the trait. And so it's just individual differences between people according to this theory. Now, where would these differences come from? Well, it could come from your genes. The idea in this argument is that we pass on our general intelligence capabilities to our offspring, that we receive them from our parents. It could be early brain development. A lot of people have put a lot of energy into the idea that with proper education and training and things like that, we will get higher levels of G from people in the long run than if they don't have adequate education when they're children. So focusing on early brain development. Health, that if a person is ill during development, it might interfere with brain health as well, and might interfere with their intellect in the long run. Here's the big question: does intelligence change with age? The idea that early brain development might have an impact on intelligence, we could probably make the argument, could it change as we grow and develop as adults also? So let's look at the cross-sectional data first. This is the first kind of data that was collected on intelligence. If you recall from earlier on in class, cross-sectional data is when you take people from different age groups and give them all the same test, and then see if people from different age groups score differently on the test. So back in 1914 to 1917, when they were screening draftees for World War I, the U.S. Army used these aptitude tests to assess the general intelligence of their new recruits. What they found in that cross-sectional data that they had collected back then was that IQ, or intelligence, peaks between 18 and 25, and that it's really a downhill slide after that. So for a long time, I think a lot of people have carried this idea that you're at your peak functioning between 18 and 25, and then it's just a slow downhill of poorer and poorer functioning with age. We'll talk about that in a second, so don't worry about that. There was a study in 1921 of inhabitants of 19 villages in New England using these same tests, and they found an even narrower range, where they found that intelligence peaks between the ages of 18 and 21. So then we're on our downhill slide from 21. They thought it was a slow decline, but what they found in their data was that the average 55-year-old in 1921 scored like the average 14-year-old. So they thought that We climb up to our peak fitness functioning, and then we decline out of it. Okay, so that's this little graphic here is kind of showing the cross-sectional method, and that bar is showing you a decline across the age groups. So we have, the different groups of people, 25, 32, 39, and so on, being compared to each other on reasoning ability score, which is one subset of a test. And you just see it looks like a really steep double black diamond ski hill, right? It's really declining off. Okay, but thank goodness we have other ways of measuring change with age. The longitudinal data is represented in this green bar. So this is the same chart I was just showing you, but now let's look at longitudinal. So now, remember from earlier in class, longitudinal, we're going to test the same people multiple times across their lifespan. So now when we look at the x-axis, those 25-year-olds get retested at 32, get retested at 39, and so on until they're 81. Same reasoning ability score on the y-axis. And so what you see is that, in fact, not only does intelligence not decline at the rate that the cross-sectional data had implied, it's actually lower to start with. In our, when we're 25, it's kind of our lowest score of our lifespan practically. I mean, we don't reach that same level again until we're 81, and that our peak functioning is going to be between the ages of 39 and 67, really. So we get a completely different picture. We get the picture from longitudinal data that for an individual across their lifespan, they're going to gain intelligence across their adulthood. And when we look at the longitudinal data, we initially have to go, okay, so what's going on with the cross-sectional data then? You guys have to remember that we have the cohort effect in place, right? So it could be that the people who were being tested back in 1914 to 1921, the younger people had more education than the older people did. It could be that the younger people had been enjoying better nutrition throughout their childhood and young adulthood compared to the older people. That by then people were having slightly smaller families. They had started to allow birth control efforts back then. And so people may have had smaller families and more resources available for each child during development. Fewer infections. They were starting to figure out, for example, smallpox vaccines and other kinds of things to reduce the rates of infections. And so people maybe stayed healthier a little bit longer. And so all of those things could contribute to why the younger people scored so much better than the older people in those cross-sectional studies. The problems with longitudinal are things like, if you're getting tested every 7 years, it's possible that you're remembering your performance across those times and you're giving the same answers, but not necessarily because you would have reasoned it out the same way now that you did, 15 years ago. It could be that you just remember the answer. There are high attrition rates in longitudinal studies where people drop out of the study for a variety of reasons. In these really longitudinal studies, we have people who drop out because they literally died during the course of the study. They might also drop out if they're not enjoying participating. And who's more likely to not enjoy participating? People who are scoring really well or people who are scoring poorly? So it's possible that there's self-selection bias where people are dropping out at different rates. So the best way for us to study whether intelligence changes with age would be to do a cross-sequential design. And you guys recall the cross-sequential design, that combination of we start out as a cross-sectional study and then we follow the individuals longitudinally. And luckily we have a really long-running Seattle longitudinal study that was begun by K. Warner Shea in 1956. Every 7 years they add a new cohort, and they've been testing and retesting. The most recent testing was 2000, actually I'm not sure 2005 was the most recent, it should have been 2012. But they keep testing and retesting, and so far they try and make sure that they keep 500 adults all together in each age cohort. So we have age cohorts in 7-year increments. We test them every 7 years. We add a new cohort every 7 years. So it's just sort of this ongoing cross-sequential design. So what have they found? Well, if we analyze the Seattle longitudinal study in like a snapshot, this was the 2005 snapshot, and we're looking at the cross-sectional snapshot between people who are right now age 25 versus people who are right now age 32 and so on, a normal cross-sectional design. And then they've given them a lot of different, they gave them an intelligence test that can be broken down into lots of different subtests. And so first let's look at the ones that look really super stable in the cross-sectional data, and that would be the numeric ability and the verbal ability. Those appear to be very stable. Those are the yellow triangles and the blue squares. The other ones all seem to be pretty close together and all showing decline, and that would be inductive reasoning, spatial orientation, perceptual speed, and verbal memory. All of those seem to be declining across the lifespan. Now let's look at the longitudinal data with people who they started studying when they were age 25 and studied repeatedly until they were age 88 as the oldest data. Now let's look at what's going on. Okay, notice that in the longitudinal data, the green circle is still showing dramatic decline from age 25 to age 88. And if we look at our legend, we see that that's perceptual speed. So that would be basically reaction time. And we were talking in the last chapter that reaction time does decline with age. So we do see that that persists within an individual across their lifespan. The other items mostly are hanging together and are showing that stability across the lifespan that we expect. The one thing that's kind of different is the numeric ability, which is shown in the yellow triangle. You see that it really starts to decline rapidly after age 60. So people seem to sort of not practice, or they've sort of forgotten their numeric abilities as they get into older adulthood. But I think we could really confidently say that overall intelligence is a very stable characteristic across an individual's lifespan, that reaction time slows, and maybe we lose a little bit of our facility with numbers, and that's about it. That's the same page. Oh, this is showing men versus women. So we see men on the, and so this is the longitudinal data only, and the men are on the left and the women are on the right. And what you see is that women maintain their, all of their scores a little longer into later adulthood than the men do. Men are showing a more dramatic drop-off after age 67 than the women are. So that's kind of an interesting sex difference that we're not exactly sure why. There are two clusters of intelligence, two types of intelligence. CATTELL said, one of the things we have to keep in mind as we're developing intelligence tests, because he was a person who developed intelligence tests, is that there are two different kinds of intelligence that we all carry around with us. Fluid intelligence is your ability to speedily process, right? To see a new problem and to figure out what the problem is and how to quickly solve it. Crystallized intelligence, on the other hand, is all of your accumulated learning, all that stuff that you know over your lifetime of learning things. So it's your knowledge of who was the first president, it's your knowledge of your phone number, it's your knowledge of what channel is CBS on. I mean, just all those weird things that you know, plus things that you've tried to learn, like what's the difference between cross-sectional and longitudinal research, right? All of those things would be examples of crystallized intelligence. So under fluid intelligence would be things like your working memory, your ability to decide what to pay attention to, what to ignore, how to assign resources to tasks. That's all working memory. Your abstract thinking is part of your fluid intelligence, trying to imagine things and think about possibilities, or imagine rotating a three-dimensional figure in space, things like that. And then of course how quickly you can think. Crystallized intelligence is going to have much more stable things like vocabulary, general information, things that you can very much retrieve from memory. So test questions that would assess fluid intelligence would be ones like what we're seeing on the screen now, where it goes circle, square, circle, square, circle, and then you're supposed to figure out what's going to come next. That's a fluid intelligence test. I picked one off of the child test so that we could all feel successful, because the answer's square. So crystallized intelligence would ask you questions like the ones we don't like from the SAT, like aphorism is to adage as. So is that the same, the opposite, or neither? Is an aphorism the same as an adage? Is it the opposite of an adage, or is it neither the same nor the opposite? I don't know how you can do neither, but okay. Unrelated, I guess. And by the way, they're basically the same. Okay. Fluid intelligence decreases with age, and part of that has to do with that speed of thinking. there's a slowing of reaction time that may make it more difficult for us as we approach 60, 70 to actually formulate the problem and come up with a solution that will work. Crystallized intelligence, on the other hand, increases with age. So the older we get, the more stuff we know. I'd like to point out there's a little possibility that the reason why fluid intelligence seems to decrease with age is that it's measured through how quickly a person solves a very novel problem, something they've never seen before. As we age, there are fewer problems that we will immediately recognize as completely novel. We're more likely to say to ourselves, oh, this reminds me of something that I've seen before, and we may try that strategy, the strategy that worked in a previous problem. And that's going to slow us down if it turns out to not be an effective problem-solving strategy for this particular problem. So it's possible that part of our slowing of thought is not actually slowing of thought, it's having more crystallized options to try, and it turning out to be the case that option didn't really work. So things to keep in mind when we read CATTELL's ideas. How about a more modern theory of intelligence? Robert Sternberg developed a theory of, he called it triarchic intelligence, 3 factors of intelligence. He says that there are 3 different kinds of intelligences that all can be measured with different kinds of behaviors. So analytic intelligence is the kind of intelligence that we need for remembering things, analyzing things, understanding things. So what CATTELL would call fluid intelligence would be part of this analytic intelligence. Certain aspects of crystallized intelligence would also fall under analytic, because if you're, for example, supposed to be solving a math problem and you have to pull out of your memory the formula for this math problem, that would be analytic intelligence. Then there's creativity. With creativity, you're supposed to find a novel solution to a problem. So something that would work without necessarily a lot of cues, without a lot of help, find a solution to the problem. So what we see with older people is a lot of times they're very creative in figuring out solutions to problems. They maybe have the problem of getting displaced because there were layoffs at work. And so they might say, well, you know what? I'm going to get creative about this. Do I want to go directly back into the exact line of business that I've been in, or do I want to get a little creative and find something that's a better match to my skills, or maybe a field that's a better match to my values, or something that helps me to achieve my other desires that are outside of work? Practical intelligence is the kind of intelligence that we need for managing everyday life. So practical intelligence, some people call street smarts, or common sense. Knowing how to budget your time so you can accomplish all the tasks you need to do. Establishing a routine so you don't forget something in the morning. Those kinds of things are all practical intelligence. What's interesting about Sternberg's model is that you can be high in all of them, none of them, some of them, they're all independent. So being high in one area doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be high in another area of intelligence. I always like to use Sheldon on Big Bang Theory as a good example of that, because he's really high in analytic intelligence, really high in creativity, and really low in practical intelligence. I guess he's got at least some practical intelligence because he has figured out that he's not very good at it, and so he's just going to have a standard routine of what he does all the time. He's not going to deviate from it. He eats this on Monday, he does his laundry on Saturday, he has his routine, and that way his activities of daily living don't get disrupted by the fact that he just can't be bothered to figure stuff out. Like he can't be bothered to get a driver's license and things like that. So he's sort of my go-to modern, fictional example of a person who's high in some and low in others. Okay, so to finish up intelligence, I wanted to talk a little bit about expert cognition. Speaking of Sheldon, I mean, you can be like an expert in one area and not necessarily in all areas. I think one of the running gags on that TV show, if you haven't seen Big Bang Theory, you just treat it like homework and watch an episode. But one of the running gags in that show is that he literally has no knowledge of how to get along with the other humans. And so that's why he gets along so well with Penny, who's really high on, interpersonal intelligence and not necessarily really high on book smarts like Sheldon is. But he's an expert in his field, right? So what makes him an expert? It turns out to be an expert in a field, you do not have to have an IQ, a high IQ. Well, we all have IQs. You don't have to have a high one. It turns out that expert cognition is oftentimes really intuitive. The person oftentimes cannot even explain how they know what they know about the thing that they know so well. If you ask them, can you break that down so I can take notes? They oftentimes will be like, I don't even know how to start to explain what I do or know. A lot of times experts rely on, their past experience. They take cues from the current context. Whereas novices, when they're trying to learn something, they are like, okay, what's the rule for that, right? What are the formal procedures so I can do like a checklist so I can always do it the same way? Experts do a lot more automatic processing. Automatic processes are those things that don't require any thinking on purpose. When the context is familiar and you're an expert in this field, you'll look at the context and go, oh, I know exactly what to do. I don't even have to think about it. I like to think about first responders, for example. They know exactly what to do when this particular thing happens, whatever emergency happens, whatever they're trained for. They don't have to think about it. They go into go mode. It requires a lot less cognitive effort if you can just go into go mode. Go with your automatic process. So once this event happens, that triggers me to do this, and then I just start going. So it's automatic, but it's strategic. Expert cognition has more strategies available to it and better strategies available to it than novices have. One of the things that novices do is they'll try their one rule and then go, well, that didn't work. It doesn't work. That's how you can tell a novice. They're like, well, it doesn't work. Whereas an expert goes, okay, that didn't work. Let me try something else. So they're much more strategic. They have maybe even in the back of their mind, they probably couldn't explain it. In the back of their mind, they have like a list of things that they know might work. And they go through that list of things and try it. I was just doing a test of Launchpad the other day, and I had gotten a complaint that the answers to the fill-in questions are not necessarily intuitive. And so I went through it and I was trying to find some to go through to experience it. And part of the problem with complaining to me about something, asking me to try it, is I didn't see a problem with the fact that when, for example, I thought the answer was frontal lobe and it told me I was wrong. So then I thought maybe it was frontal cortex, and then it told me I was wrong. And then I thought, well, maybe it's prefrontal cortex, and then I was right. And it didn't feel like I had done any kind of expert level, strategy to try and figure it out. But if you're brand new in something, knowing that those are all sort of the same / a little bit of a variation is a lot harder than when you're an expert in something. So I think that's a good example of what I mean by strategic. Expert cognition is very flexible. People who are experts in an area want to know even more about the thing that they're experts in. They don't say to themselves, well, I know everything and now we can quit asking. They instead are creative, they're curious, they want to know more. People who are experts in an area are a lot more flexible in the face of the unexpected. They can handle unexpected events a lot better, and they have like more options available to them. Now, I brought up expertise because of its close tie, at least in the popular understanding, to intelligence. But the truth is, it's really tied to age. The older we get, the more likely we are to have encountered circumstances that may lead us to become experts in something. Training that's more likely to contribute to our expertise. Discovering that we have a talent in a particular area, that oftentimes takes a lot of time to figure out what our talents are. Finding out that we have a great ability in something. Practicing, it takes years to become an expert. It takes thousands of hours in an area to get good enough to actually move into that state of mind which is true expertise. And that's much more likely to happen with age. So it's really hard to become an expert in something when you're 12. Much more likely when you're 42. because you've had enough time, enough exposure, enough experience, enough training, enough practice to figure out what your abilities are and to put yourself into the right circumstances that you can actually then become a true expert in something. Older experts, people who know a lot about something and are true experts in an area, as they age, oftentimes do not look like they are losing any of their expertise, because even as maybe, for example, their reaction time slows, they can use selective optimization and compensation to make sure that they're still performing at their top level. So we see, I just saw a citation that was of Michael Gazzaniga, who has been doing research on split brain patients since the 1960s. So I don't know how old he is, but I'm going to do the math and say pretty old. And he just published something. Being older and being an expert in something makes what was very painful and like really hard to do when they were in their 20s or 30s a piece of cake to do when they're in their 70s or 80s, because they have all this background to help them to selectively optimize and to compensate for any shortcomings that have started to occur. All right, let's stop there and we'll come back and we'll talk about work in adulthood.